Let's explore some of the tools in Resolve that let us adjust contrast. Let's go ahead and move over to shot 41. I'll middle button mouse click on one of our other shots we've been working with. Make sure that our color space transform is set up, and we'll work on this first node. We haven't done anything to this image other than put our color transform on. And you'll notice that when you do put on that color transform, the contrast of this log image goes way up. Here in our log footage, the difference between the darkest parts, maybe right here, and the lightest parts is not super huge. But with our color transform on, there's a massive difference. That's because the major way that log footage really keeps that detail in the brightest and darkest parts of the image is by lowering the contrast. So if anything's really, really bright, we're making sure that it's still in this range that we can record. But once we put that color transform on, it ups that contrast so that it looks nice on our monitor. So now what if we want to do a little bit more here? Well, there's a couple things we can do to adjust contrast. The first one, that's probably the most obvious, is this little contrast slider. If I grab it and drag it to the right, that will increase our contrast. And if I take it to the left, it will decrease it. I can actually bring this back to the point where it looks close to kind of how it did before. In fact, let's take off this color transform for just a minute so that we can explore what this contrast control does. I'll push this contrast up, and I'm going to bring it up way more than I normally would. Something like that. Because I want to talk about this little control here, pivot, which is right next to contrast. The pivot and the contrast slider work together. Contrast pushes up the brighter parts and pushes down the lower parts. The pivot is kind of where that threshold is between dark and light. So if I were to take the pivot and move it to the left, we'll see a lot more of the image gets boosted up because everything over 20% or so is getting pushed up in exposure. Same thing if we were to take this and move it back to the right and put this at, say, 0.6, anything over 60% or so is getting pushed down. And so this is a great way to kind of dial in exactly what your image looks like while keeping the same amount of contrast. So if we boost this up to something sort of healthy and move our pivot around, we can decide how much detail we want to keep in those shadows, or if we just want them to fall back into darkness. I'll reset our node grade here. The next control we can talk about with contrast are these shadow and highlight controls. This is almost like the contrast kind of being split up into two different parts. If I take this highlight and I push it up, it's going to make the brighter parts brighter. Take the shadows down, it's going to make the darker parts darker. But it's not the brightest parts or the darkest parts. It's kind of the upper darker parts and the lower lighter parts. Like if we were to do this on a curve, highlights is like taking a dot on this curve and moving it back and forth like this. Shadows is kind of like having a dot right here. Of course, we can always adjust our gain and our lift to adjust our contrast. So I can push my gain up and bring my lift down, and that's going to increase our contrast because our brightest parts are getting brighter and our darkest parts are getting darker, and the difference between them is increasing. So there are a lot of different ways you can adjust contrast just within the primary color wheels. And if you went to the log wheels, you can of course adjust the highlights and change their range and get some more control that way. In addition to that, we also have controls in our curves to adjust contrast. We can make the darker parts darker and the brighter parts brighter like this, and boom, we have increased contrast. And like we learned about in the curve section, if we take something like this and make a little S curve, that's going to make more contrast as well. So we have a ton of different controls to adjust our contrast. And of course, on our surface, we have a contrast knob as well as a pivot knob. And so we can boost up that contrast and adjust the pivot here with a little more tactile control. We can also adjust the shadows and highlights here with these knobs. And of course, the lift and the gain. So those are the major tools for adjusting contrast in the color page.